very much for coming. As you can see today, we are going to talk about Egypt's revolution. But before that, just a couple of words, and one of which is that whether it's war or revolution, they always leave behind images. And one of the early images I can remember was this child in Rwanda, malnourished, absolutely hungry, about to die. And the image was a photograph of a vulture sitting next to that child. That was an amazing sort of a commentary on that particular war. Then the Vietnam War. It had many, many images. And I recall an image which was, again, much imprinted in the mind, was of that little girl running away, stark naked, running, and behind her, the fire of the napalm bomb. So there are images and images. One of the most recent images goes back to about 7 months ago, 17th of December, when you had a very young man, Mohammed Bawazizi, stopped by 2 policemen, his car overturned and his vegetable and his fruits destroyed. He's so upset, and this has happened to him many times before, but this time he's so upset, he goes to the governor's office. First he doesn't get admitted. You are a vegetable seller. He doesn't get admitted. In fact, he's refused. And someone slaps him. And this someone happened to be a lady. That is even worse. So he goes down, gets some gasoline, which we all know, douses himself, and lights radio. It cracks the Middle East. He would die 3 weeks later without knowing that subsequently Ben Ali had to go, and subsequently he had to go to Tahrir Square, a square which many of us did not know if you did not study Middle East. But the interesting thing was, there was that image. Same like you'll remember the Vietnamese monks did it much earlier. Again, a stark image of someone doing something and leaving behind many things undone. But before I pass it over to our speaker, we were just talking something else. While these things are going on, there are also groups of people who are looking post, much post, looking at rehabilitation, looking at revitalizing economies. And I was mentioning to my 2 colleagues here that the governor of Qum, Governor General of Qum, was here just a couple of days ago. We had lunch yesterday. And the interesting thing was, he was interested, he came for a meeting of mayors. But his interest was, how do you do this? How do you get so many million people? How can our aircraft fly here? So one of the guests said, listen, some of the other countries had these problems before. They took travel agents from here, sent them across to their respective countries, and then showed them, look, this is what we have. These are the things we can do for your traveler. He says, why don't you do that? He said, yeah, very interesting. Then he said, you have a water conference going on. I want to attend. Now, he brought with him 4 or 5 people, and he's a cleric too. So you would expect, no, the people he brought were people from his commercial department. So while you are getting images, thanks to great photographers and in your living room, thanks to all these people, you're getting stark images. There are images that are not yet recorded. There are events which are happening behind the scenes to rehabilitate, to go back into the mainstream. Guest speaker today, thank you very much for accepting our request, is Dr. Helia. And there's a lot of, there's a string of things, so I had to read a lot of it. I couldn't memorize this. I tried, I came up after 2. So Dr. Helia is fellow at the Center for Research in Ethnic Relations. He was formerly a Ford Foundation Fellow. He was member of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. He was professor of law at the American University in Cairo. I think that's in London. Oh yes, and he was in Paris, correct. So he knows the place, he knows it very well, and we thank you very much, and we want to listen to him. Thank you, sir. Please welcome.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me in the back? Okay. This thing's on, right? Good. First, a real thank you to Ambassador Matthews and to his team. It's always a great pleasure to come to Singapore because I know everything will be organized down to the last possible detail. In fact, details that I ordinarily wouldn't even imagine were details in the first place. But everything was very comfortably organized from day one up until this very moment, and I'm sure even the follow-up has already been put into motion. And it's very interesting for me to come and talk about this here in Singapore because I've never had the opportunity before 2011 to ever be asked to speak about Egypt outside of Egypt. You know, nobody was ever interested really in knowing too much about this country, particularly in the last 10 years. And in fact, one of the reasons why I was actually in Egypt for the past 7 months was because, frankly, I needed a bit of a break from all of my activities in the UK. So I took a sabbatical to go to Cairo under the pretext that actually I was going to somewhere that would be rather peaceful and uneventful. It didn't quite work out like that. Within a few weeks, Tunisia had erupted, and very soon after that, much to my surprise as well as to the surprise of most Egyptians that I knew, Cairo itself and then spread to Alexandria and to other cities had suddenly gone into overdrive. So my plan of having a peaceful few months sabbatical didn't quite work out the way I planned. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Egyptian revolution as I see it progressing into the next stage, and the phrase of it being possibly undone, as it were. But before I do that, I think it's very important for people who work there to have a bit of a feeling as to what was actually the feeling in Cairo, in Egypt, in general, during the uprising and those early weeks after President Mubarak decided to take a vacation to Sharm el-Sheikh. It's something very, very special that I've never experienced anywhere else in the world. And I've struggled to try to impart that feeling to people by just giving a few minutes of a lecture or a seminar. But I found one way to get around that, and that was by playing a video. A video of what was actually produced during the uprising and quickly became almost the anthem of the revolution. And it's called Sawt al-Hurriya, which means the sound of freedom. And it was made by a few young Egyptian lads. And I want to show you that video because the footage is all from Tahrir Square. None of it was engineered, none of it was doctored. No, everything was from Tahrir Square. And it shows so much of what made those 18 days so special. So it's not long, it's only about 3 minutes or so, and then we'll continue on to the lecture.
نزلت وقلت انا مش راجع وكتبت الدم في كل شارع سمعنا اللي ما كانش سامع واتكسرت كل الموانع سلاحنا كان احلامنا وبكره واضح قدامنا من الزمان بنستنى بنطوع مش لاقي مكاننا في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي رفعنا راسنا في السماء والجوع ما بقاش بيهمنا أهم حاجة حقنا ونكتب تاريخنا بدمنا لو كنت واحد مننا بلاش ترغي وتقول لنا نمشي ونسيب حلمنا وبطل تقول كلمة أنا في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي
أيادي مصرية سمراء فيها في الجميل موجودة وسط السفير بتكسر البراويل طلع الشباب البديع قلبوا خريف أراضيع وحققوا المعجزة صحوا الأسير بالأجل اقتلني أجري ما حيعيش دولة الفرق بكتب بدمي حياة تانية لأوطاني دمي تولى الربيع الاثنين بلون أخضر وببتسم من تحدي والأحزان
كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي صوت الحرية
You know, for any Egyptian that was actually there, watching that video always gives a bit of a tear in our eyes, because we remember some of the best things of Egypt actually from that square. You know, people talk a lot about, you know, values and cultures, and you know, this is a Singaporean value and this is an Egyptian value and so on. And one of the things that I think many people feel is very Egyptian, for example, is hospitality, and you know, greeting the stranger and so on. And then you go to Egypt and you find customs officials at the airport really not being very welcoming to guests, for example, or that you know, Arabs are generally quite hospitable, or you know, really welcome people into their homes and so on. And then you find that, you know, the modern world has really, you know, turned a lot of that on its heads and so on. I bring that up because it was incredible to see in Tahrir Square all of these values that people talk about when they're teaching their children, when they're talking in schools. You know, this is Egyptian culture, this is an Arabic value, etc. Those things were all there in the square. So you saw, for example, something that's very Egyptian that, you know, I know, my father's English and my mother's Egyptian, and I remember my mother repeating many times about how when she was growing up, it was very Egyptian that, different religious groups were very much considered to be part of the same society. So Muslims would be in Catholic schools with the Jewish classmates, you know, something very, very common within Egyptian society, where, you know, sexual harassment was unheard of, where you had people really going out of their way to take care of their neighborhoods and so on. None of that has been really evident in the past few years. You see how civil society in Egypt, as well as other parts of the Arab world, has been crushed and disappeared. You see how sexual harassment suddenly became one of the most talked about things in Egypt because of the amount of incidents that were taking place. Fortunately not violent ones, but still in quite poor taste, if nothing else. How there were different tensions that were arising between different religious groups. That wasn't evident in Tahrir. You know, one of the most famous pictures of the revolution was how on Fridays, when Muslims were praying their Friday congregational prayer, the Christians would surround them and protect them from any thugs or police forces that were nearby, and vice versa, that whenever there was mass carried out by the Coptic Christian community, that Muslims would likewise surround them and protect them from anybody coming to harm them. When women went through the square, and the square was very crowded, it was like Moses in the Red Sea. You know, roads would appear and just part, so that ladies could walk through without feeling that anybody was going to harass them in any way. And you saw, I mean, there were a few statements there that I thought were very significant. The first was, you know, if you would be one of us, then stop saying the word I, i.e. stop thinking about yourself. It had a double meaning. Stop thinking about yourself to, you know, all Egyptians, and think about, you know, your country, but also to Hosni Mubarak, who kept on saying, I am your father, I am this, I am that. And it was very interesting. You know, Hosni Mubarak, like many of these other autocrats in the Arab world, did everything 10 days late. You know, I mean, he gave all these speeches, and had he given the speech that he had given 10 days in at the beginning, there would have been no uprising. If he had given the speech that he had given 20 days in, 10 days in, then the uprising would have ended. He always managed to do things very late. And in each of those speeches, he just, you know, talked to people as though they were children, which, you know, was simply the mindset that he was operating with them, but simply didn't work in a society that had changed, I mean, really overnight. I remember the first Friday after January 25th, where I woke up in the morning and I couldn't send SMSs from my phone. I couldn't actually use my mobile telephone. The internet was disconnected. The police were gone. They were just gone. I mean, I woke up and I went driving around, and the police were gone. They were absent from the streets. And if anybody hears me to Cairo, then you know the police are everywhere. You know, they're absolutely everywhere. And there was not a single policeman in sight. And all of that was a bit strange for the better part of the day. And then towards, you know, the end of the day, we heard that prisons had been opened and convicts had been released. And then suddenly strange became dangerous. And I fully expected that Egyptians would sink into their shells, bolt down the doors, and cower, waiting for everything to sort of fall back into place, because they had relied on a police state for so long. And then I got a call I got a call from somebody else in the district saying, you know, some of the men in our building are coming down to protect the building. It might be something you guys want to consider in your own. I said, okay. My father-in-law was around, so we went down expecting that we would be the only two guys in front of the building. And when we got down, we found that nearly all the men in our building weren't in front of the building. They weren't even in front of the street. They were participating in neighborhood committees defending the entire district, and had set up popular committees, popular checkpoints across the district, somehow out of nothing. I never would have expected this. In fact, none of us expected it. Nobody expected it. I wouldn't expect it in my own country, in the United Kingdom. I wouldn't have expected it there, but it just happened, like that. And all of that was really quite something to live through, and I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to live through that, and to see that the culture of fear that so characterized Egyptian society for at least the past 20 years was suddenly gone, and that people dared to hope again. People dared to hope again. They had earned the right, they felt, to hope again. And if any of you have been to Egypt, then you know what that means. You know what a change that is to the Egyptian people. But that's February. We're now in July, and actually tomorrow, I'm very sad that I'm in Singapore, because tomorrow there will be a huge rally in Tahrir Square to declare the continuation and the reinforcement of the revolution, of the Thawra. And I'm sad that I can't be there to see how it goes. But it shows something very clear, that people are very unsatisfied with how the revolution has proceeded, in terms of its speed, as well as what has actually been physically accomplished by the changes in the state mechanisms. Hosni Mubarak was forced out of power. And it's been declared that he will stand trial. At first they said August 3rd. I doubt that will happen. I think that they'll either postpone it, or they'll probably never actually make it happen. He'll probably die first, by natural or unnatural causes. I mean that very seriously. You don't get to be a president of a country like Egypt for 30 years without having a lot of skeletons that don't belong to you in your closet. So I suspect that it's very likely that he will never stand trial. Either just be kept under constant house arrest, or somehow he'll just die. So I think that's quite likely. But we also see that besides Hosni Mubarak, a number of state officials have been arrested and have been put behind bars, but they haven't been put on trial. And some people were actually acquitted yesterday. Some of the high-ranking members of the Mubarak regime were acquitted for certain charges, and there are other charges that will happen. We see that elections are being declared for September, for parliament, and presidential elections are being declared for October. But it's quite likely that the military will choose to delay those as well. We see that the different popular committees that sprouted up all over Egypt to defend their districts and their neighborhoods, that they are being left out of the political and social discussion that is, ongoing in different parts of the media, both in print and on television. We see that, unfortunately, there were great tensions that erupted between the Coptic Christian community and the Muslim community in Egypt as well. And I don't think that these were huge-scale sectarian outbreaks, but there were definitely tensions that nobody thought would happen, especially after Tahrir Square, because it wasn't like that in the square at all. And even when the protests keep going down to Tahrir, you can see it replicated again, that in the morning there'll be a mass and they'll be protected, in the afternoon there'll be Jum'ah, the Friday prayer, and they'll be protected, and so on. But you do see that some of the old tribal sort of issues that have taken place outside of Cairo, or even certain districts of Cairo, where they take on a religious sort of coloring, that definitely happens. You also see that the unity between the revolutionary forces during the uprising and those first weeks after the uprising has broken down quite a bit, where the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, who were part and parcel of the revolutionary forces, have decided to carve, their own sort of route and sort of go it alone. And unfortunately, their opponents, their unnatural allies in the revolution, quote-unquote liberals and secularists, are all too happy to push them as far away as possible from them, despite the fact that probably the Ikhwan have far more grassroots support in Egypt than most of those groups put together. You see even within these groups that there are huge amounts of infighting within the liberal camp, within the Islamist camp. You even see, unfortunately, some of the secularist elite pushing for the military to be given a constitutional role in defending the secular nature of the state. I think some people just don't learn from history. It's never a good idea when you invite the military to be involved in the running of your country, but this is what some of them actually want. And this is why elections are going to be very difficult when they do actually happen. The revolutionary forces are definitely not united, it's great that tomorrow actually all of them are descending on Tahrir, all of them, including the Ikhwan, including the Muslim Brotherhood. Even though to begin with the Muslim Brotherhood was not going to go because they thought that it would be a rally in support of writing a constitution before the elections. And this was something that they thought was, completely outrageous because of the referendum that took place early on in the year, where it seemed clear that the Egyptian people were happy with the roadmap that actually led to elections first, and then produce a constitution from an elected body from within parliament. Obviously, the Ikhwan are quite happy about that idea because they stand to do quite well in elections, because they're quite well organized. Unlike most of these other groups, the liberal groups and the secularist groups. The reality of the situation is that even if the secular and liberal groupings within Egypt had a lot more time, they probably wouldn't do all that well. It takes a while to build up a political strategy and party, and unfortunately, I've been viewing this, on a daily basis for the past few months. Many of these parties are simply without strategy. They're doing a lot of complaining, they're doing a lot of awareness raising, but when it comes to actually formulating plans and platforms for the election process, the Ikhwan are far ahead of them in every sense of the word. They're focusing very clearly on particular goals and aims and timetables, whereas one liberal party, I was shocked, actually launched a more high-profile launch in London and Paris than they did in Cairo, which says a lot about who they're actually talking to. So this is a great problem that we have, where the political arena within Egypt has become not fragmented. That's not, I suppose, the right word, but it's being fraught with debates over issues that really don't matter to the vast majority of the Egyptian people. The vast majority of the Egyptian people are thinking about three things. One, they want this revolution to succeed. Two, they think that means that the security situation should be improved because it's still not back to what it was. And three, that the revolution should be able to do something about the economy. And keeping in mind that around 40% of the Egyptian population exists around the poverty line. They've actually lost out through the revolution, maybe in the short term, but they've lost out in the last few months. It's become very difficult for them. I left Cairo last week on Friday, and I passed through Malaysia on my way in, and I met a young man selling souvenirs in Johor. I drove from Johor this morning, and he was Egyptian. And I said, "Hi, how long have you been in Malaysia?" He said, "A month." I said, "A month? You left after the revolution?" I said, and he looked very embarrassed and bashful and said, "I did." And I said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "I couldn't find any work. I couldn't survive." And that's extremely unfortunate. He had the option to leave. Most people don't actually have that option. So these will be problems that I think will prove to be very difficult to solve in the coming elections. I think that the role of the military is yet to be decided. The military is very clear about the fact that they don't want to be in power, or at least not govern. That's probably a better way of putting it. They don't wish to govern the country. At the moment, they are actually governing the country. They want to retreat back to their barracks, and it's been from their barracks where they've ruled a fair amount of Egyptian society at large. They're owning a lot of businesses and so on. But their primary sort of role is to defend the borders. At the moment, they're not in that position, and they never wanted to be in that position. They didn't overthrow Hosni Mubarak because they wanted to take his place. They overthrew Hosni Mubarak because they thought that he really couldn't keep control over the country anymore. It was always about that. It was about maintaining a certain level of stability. And as soon as they can, I'm sure that they will actually leave and go back to their barracks. The question will be what sort of political arrangement happens when they do leave. And they're not particularly interested in anything other than stability. So they will try their best to craft an arrangement that just ensures that they don't need to come out of their barracks for a very, very long time. And that will be their most pressing concern. In the meantime, however, it means that these different political forces are going to have to find ways to actually coexist with each other and build something new. And Egypt is very pivotal in this. I mean, I wrote this in my abstract. Not simply because Egyptians think that Egypt is Dunya, the mother of the world, which they do. But really because Egypt is incredibly pivotal in a geostrategic and geopolitical sense. Extremely pivotal. I mean, when Tunisia happened, unfortunately, nobody gives credit to the Tunisians anymore. So everybody's talking about Tahrir Square and Egypt and so on. Even though without Tunisia, there would have been no Tahrir. But the truth of the matter is that without Tahrir, there would have been nothing else. Everybody was waiting for Egypt. Everybody was waiting for Egypt. So if Egypt hadn't actually happened, then nothing else would have happened. I think that that's very, very clear. But equally, had Tunisia not happened, then Egypt would not happen. And if Egypt is successful in its creating a new type of public space and a new type of public sphere, and an arrangement between the citizenry and those who that rule, then it will have dramatic consequences, I think, for the rest of the Arab region. And this has been the case in the past, where things that happen in Egypt, they do have effects on a cultural level, but also a political level. Just taking the legal system and constitutions across the Arab region have always been influenced by what happened in Egypt. Okay, Egypt is where anything from a quarter to a fifth of the entire Arab world population lives. Okay, and Egypt is where, unfortunately, they do a lot of bad soap operas that everybody watches, so they actually understand Egyptian Arabic more than they understand other types of Arabic. So it is extremely pivotal if it does succeed, but equally if it fails. If it fails, then that will also have repercussions throughout the region. And I think a lot of people are waiting to see what happens. Egypt is pivotal beyond the region as well, in the international arena. And there are already, huge promises from different Western powers to try to get involved in what's happening in Egypt at present. And we'll see how that all works out, because of obviously the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. That's an important aspect of that relationship. But also in terms of economic prowess, and even on things such as religion. The Azhar University is extremely influential throughout the Sunni Muslim world, and it's based in Egypt. And the Azhar is something that also may see a great deal of change in the coming months and years. In fact, it's quite remarkable that on the day after Hosni Mubarak left office, the Sheikh al-Azhar, the head of the Azhar University, which again is the premier Sunni Islamic institution in the world, he declared that he wanted to have his post be filled by somebody who would be elected as opposed to being appointed by the Egyptian president. That's a huge change. That's a massive shift. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but it just goes to show that what happens in Egypt will have repercussions elsewhere. Now, I've spoken for about half an hour, 45 minutes, which is what I wanted, not because I would like to spare you all from my droning voice, but I would also like to encourage you to get involved in a bit of a discussion here, because things are moving very quickly on a day-to-day basis within Egypt and within the region at large. And I wanted to spare a good portion of time for us to have that sort of discussion and for me to offer what limited thoughts that I had. So with that, thank you again for listening to me over the past half hour or so, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Hilaire said, he would like comments, suggestions, etc., and the floor is open. Please identify yourself. And, yes, Ambassador.
Shahid Ali, Senior Fellow in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. I spent 5 years in Cairo until last year. So I'm sorry I was not there. I heard that what you mentioned about community and so on, the same thing happened where I was staying in Zamalek. Then they had to take matters into their own hands and protect, because the danger was coming from people coming in from outside, from the slum areas, from the practically ungovernable areas of Cairo, which had not been mentioned. Muqaddam area, from Imbaba, from all these places and all that. So there was dangers of criminal activities by unnamed and certain people. This question of law and order, which arose because of the disappearance of the police. The police apparently have been completely discredited, the security services have been discredited, disbanded. So the question arises about what is taking their place. In other words, also what is or who and what are running the system now. It's a huge bureaucracy. The government in Cairo and in Egypt is a huge bureaucracy. Are these people in place? Are they still running something? Besides the ministry, and or is there going to be changes in this setup of the government and services?
Yes, we can get a couple of questions.
Okay.
Can we get 2 more questions and yeah. I know you very well, but
Young Razali from Pakistan as well. Same school as the only question would be then, what's going to happen to the revolution now, moving forward? So there's a big question about where we should be all prognosis.
anything else? Yes, please, Donna.
I'm David White. I'm retired here. I've only spent 1 week in Cairo, so I can't speak with any expertise. But the only thing that could
You can come back. You can come back. We'll welcome you.
Okay. The only thing that could unite the Republicans in the United States with the strong man in Yemen is evoking fears of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's a strange, unholy alliance if there ever was one. Is the Muslim Brotherhood perceived in Egypt as the same kind of boogeyman that these people try to portray them?
Well, my question is about the Ikhwan, so
Okay,
maybe I should
please,
just ask
yes.
it.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rana, with the Middle East Institure. Can you talk a little bit about the partnerships that seem to have developed between the Ikhwan and the military?
With one hand,
The military.
Okay. You've been following things closely, Rana. There. Okay, right. These are very good questions. It shows that actually people have been watching very closely what's happening in Egypt. In terms of the police being discredited, obviously they were actually discredited long before the revolution actually took place, which was one of the key reasons behind the revolution taking place. The level of brutality and non-accountability of the police force and the secret services was definitely something that motivated a great deal of people. In fact, on January 25th is, if I'm not mistaken, the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. Am I right? This is Middle East Institute. You guys should be able to confirm that for me. So as a result of that, on January 25, we had the regime in Iran congratulating the Egyptian people on their Islamic Revolution. Saying, wow, you guys were so inspired by us, 32 years ago. Actually, the reason why it was January 25 was because that's Police Day in Egypt. Okay, and it's supposed to be a day off for people to express their thanks to the Egyptian police. So the Egyptians expressed their thanks with a great deal of gusto, I think. The reality of the situation is that the Egyptian police, while they're not all sort of evil, corrupt little men, the level of corruption and brutality that exists within the British police, the Egyptian police force is extremely widespread and very deep, and I don't know if there are many Egyptians who haven't actually experienced that firsthand, unless you're lucky enough to be part of the elite, in which case you simply don't deal with them. But that's maybe 10 to 15% of the population at large. So the police have definitely been discredited. It took them a while to even come out onto the streets after they were ordered to do so, and they're still not out in full force. And they feel very targeted by the population at large, which has no respect for them whatsoever, and feel now empowered actually to voice their discontent and their opposition to them in a way that I think is quite healthy, but ultimately can be destructive if something doesn't take its place. And this is another reason why there will be a huge rally tomorrow in Tahrir Square, because last week, I'll give you, it's not an anecdote, but I didn't want to give too many details about this, but I think it's important to just elaborate this point. Last week there was a protest, or not, it was a pretty small protest outside of the main television, national television building near Tahrir Square. It's called Maspiro. And it was a small protest made up of families of people who had died. Okay, around 1,000 people died in the uprising, and the families of what we call shuhada were there protesting because nobody had paid any attention to them. Nobody was giving them any notice. And then they heard that there was some sort of event commemorating the shuhada in another part of Cairo, not too far away. So they went there, and the police wouldn't let them in. Said, no, you're not really families of shuhada, or something like that. There's a rumor that actually that event was to commemorate the fallen of the police force, not the 1,000 civilians that died. So they got beaten up and whatever after trying to break through the barricade. Ordinarily, this would have turned into nothing, and it should have turned into nothing. Some of the families ran into some activists, and those activists got very, and rightly so, very upset, so they went to protest in front of the Ministry of the Interior. Again, not a big deal. It shouldn't have been a big deal. When they got to the Ministry of the Interior, the police were there, and they clamped down on them like a ton of bricks. Tear gas, rubber bullets, beatings, and then it all kicked off. You know, they really thought that this was pre-January 25. And suddenly you found hundreds and then thousands of people descending on Tahrir. This was late at night, you know, and it went on for a good day and a half. For no other reason except the police have to know that we will not tolerate this anymore. We will not accept that Egyptian police are there to brutalize the Egyptian citizenry. We only accept that they're there to protect the Egyptian citizenry. It was a big sort of thing, which is why there's going to be this big rally tomorrow. There was one planned already for tomorrow, but it was much more about, you know, are we going to have trials for the fallen members of the regime? Are we going to have constitution first, as opposed to elections first, etc., etc. But now, you know, people are coming, I think, you know, in hundreds of thousands, because they want to let the Egyptian regime know we will not tolerate having this sort of police force in place any longer. But the rehabilitation of that police force hasn't really been taken forward. And the Ministry of the Interior has been saying for months that there should be some sort of reform process. A lot of it's psychological, frankly, to re-educate police officers, but it doesn't seem to have taken place or even be planned properly. So that's one aspect of it. The second, you mentioned about the Secret Service. The Secret Service was indeed disbanded, but it's unclear as to how really absent it is, because now we have another secret service which had its name changed. I mean, it used to be called Amn al-Dawla, state security, right? Now it's called Amn al-Watan, national security. And they said, but we've changed their parameters, we've changed what they're supposed to be doing, and so on. But that's unclear. But so far we haven't heard of many sort of problems in that regard. But who really hears about what happens in the Secret Service anyway? What's the system now in Egypt? Well, at the head of every ministry there is somebody from the military. It is a military regime at the moment. There is a transitional government as well that was appointed, made up of technocrats. And leading that government is Aysam Sharaf, who's an American-educated economist, and who was actually in Hosni Mubarak's government for a short period of time, I think in charge of planning and transportation, and resigned because I can't do this. This was a few years ago. He came to Tahrir, actually, after being pronounced as prime minister, asking for the people to anoint him in the sacred place of Tahrir. People loved him for that. They really did. And people are still trying to give him a lot of leeway, but at the end of the day, he's not in charge. The military is in charge. And while I believe the transitional government is very concerned about changing systems and reforming certain institutions and so on, the military isn't opposed to that, isn't trying to have a bad system in place. But this is not the military's interest. The military's interest is stability. Okay, so trying to square those two different sort of approaches is difficult. So we wait to see what will happen, and that sort of is the answer to your question: what happens going forward? We don't actually know, because it will be down to how these different approaches from within the transitional government and the military can be joined together. It's down to who will actually enter parliament, I'm going to have to draw some of these things about the Brotherhood in at the same time, because the Brotherhood declared that they would run candidates for a maximum of 50% of the seats. Okay. Now, having said that, they first said it was going to be 30%. And then 30 becomes 35, and 35 becomes 40, and 40 becomes 45, and then it finally became 50. But now they've settled on 50, and that begs the question: what's going to happen to the other 50%? If they're not running for that, then does that mean that the smaller, newer parties are going to get them, or does it mean that remnants of the old regime may get them? So Hizb al-Watani, the party of Hosni Mubarak, members of the party have been banned from running in elections for 5 years. Okay. Having said that, it doesn't mean that they won't support other people to take their place. So we're very curious as to what will actually happen in September. If the Ikhwan are running candidates in 50% of the seats, and let's say they get them, I doubt very much they'll get all of them anyway. I think if it was down to a national vote, then probably the Ikhwan would get anything from 20 to 30% of the seats. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they do get all 50% that they're actually aiming for. What happens to the other 50%? And it's a crucial sort of election, because that parliament will then decide who gets to be on the constitutional committee that actually forms the constitution and puts it to referendum and so on. So we don't know what will happen then. And it's also not clear if elections will happen in September. The Brotherhood has also said they will not run a candidate for the presidency. Having said that, 3 people who were in the Brotherhood, one of which got kicked out because he's running for president, another one who hasn't been kicked out yet but is likely to, and the third one who's never, he's been identified with the Muslim Brotherhood sort of trend, as it were, but I don't think he's actually a paid-up member. So we wait to see how that will actually all work out. Fears of the Brotherhood. So in Yemen, I think Republicans were more afraid of Al-Qaeda than the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood aren't actually active in Yemen that much. But there is that conflation between the two in a lot of people's discussions about, Islamist politics within the region. The Al-Qaeda is simply, actually the Muslim Brotherhood is Al-Qaeda light, which I think is incredibly unfair and very inappropriate. And I come from, at least on a practitioner basis, a counterterrorism background. And in the UK, we've worked with different Brotherhood types of groups in order to make sure that Al-Qaeda didn't actually get too far in. And that's happened in different parts of the Arab world as well. But the fear-mongering about the Brotherhood in Egypt was one of the reasons why Hosni Mubarak was able to stay in power for so long. And the constant sort of reminder was either you put up with an autocrat like Hosni Mubarak, or you welcome the Brotherhood to take over Egypt. And that's a very interesting sort of thing, because we finally had what seems to have been I hope it's accurate. The Gallup poll? So Gallup actually held a poll using its methodology in Egypt, I think it was a couple of months ago, and asked people, who would you vote for in an election? And 15% said they would vote for the Brotherhood. 1-5. Now, 15% doesn't mean that they necessarily get only 15% of the seats, because, in any electoral system, okay, the numbers of votes that you get nationwide doesn't necessarily translate into 50% of the seats. It could be less, or it could be a lot more. We don't know. I mean, I think in Turkey, for example, I think the ruling party got 30% nationwide, but they stormed parliament. They almost got an absolute majority because of the way that the voting system works. So that's just down to electoral system. So we don't know. We do know, however, that while support in terms of voting patterns might be 15%, popular perceptions of the Brotherhood far outweigh those. And we had another poll, not from Gallup, I think it was Pew, that did a poll earlier on in the year asking people, what do you think the Brotherhood are good? And I think around 70% of the Egyptian population had favorable things to say about the Brotherhood, which is very natural when you consider that while we may constantly look at them as a political organization, by and large they're actually a social one, and they provide huge amounts of social services in parts of the country that nobody ever talks about, nobody ever touches. And also, Egypt is predominantly a religiously conservative society. So when you have people saying, I'm working on behalf of our religion and our prophet and so on and so on and so on, just by saying that, people are going to, feel sentimentally obliged to give them at least, I think positively of that. So I think that that's something that is definitely the case for large swathes of Egyptians. Having said that, 15% said they would vote. Okay, so there's a difference between saying, I think I may have positive things to say about the Brotherhood, and saying I want to have them run my country. The final point, the partnership between the Ikhwan and the military. Well, it's not been made public, but I think that a lot of observers would think that there's at least some sort of connivance between the two. It's not because the army's become Ikhwan, it's because the army wants stability. And the Brotherhood, at least I think in their perspective, can provide some of that stability by sheer force of numbers. And because it is the most organized political force in Egypt, obviously outside of Hizb al-Watani. These new parties, which I may like and admire very much and might even vote for, who knows, but that's not the issue. They're very new, and they won't have established the infrastructure that they require, and I think the military knows that. They may also, and I'm not sure about this, but they may also perceive the Brotherhood to be a counter force to this new sort of perception around the Salafi movements in Egypt. That's a speculation on my part, but you definitely see that there are certain parts of the elite within Egypt that are terrified about this new sort of political Salafism that was jumping around. And I think that might have something to do with it. But I really think it's down really to the aspect of stability, that they probably think that the Brotherhood can provide them with some stability. And we'll see. You know, I mean, Islamist movements have gone to the ballot box in other parts of the Muslim world and the Arab world before, and they expect to do really well. Within an election or two, suddenly they drop to like 2, 3, 4%, because ideology doesn't do it. You know, you need to be pragmatic. You need to be able to, you know, actually run things. And we will wait to see. And I mean, I won't go into this unless somebody asks about it. But you know, the Brotherhood itself is going through a lot of problems. You know, there's a lot of divisions within the Brotherhood. There's a lot of discussions and debates, and it's carving itself up into little parties as well. So we wait to see. Maybe something will happen. I'm not sure.
Thank you. Another, yes, please.
Yes, you started very...
Sorry, my friend. I know you, but you must identify yourself.
Oh, my name is Muhammad Talib. I'm Yemeni origin, Singapore citizen. We are the first family in Singapore to invest in Cairo in the 1950s.
Mabrook.
Yes. We still have confidence in Cairo.
I hope that your investments haven't
Most
suffered.
of my cousins are educated in Cairo, and they're doing very well in Singapore and in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. The point I want to say...
So was I right when I said Egypt is Dunya?
Of course.
Okay.
I believe that. But my point is that we started the lecture feeling very excited and optimistic about things. Then suddenly there's a sinking feeling. As I sit here, I can feel the sinking feeling that you are trying to portray to us. But the problem in the Middle East is not inter-ethnic or inter-religious problems. You have some experience in work, I think. You've done some ethnic research, inter-ethnic research, so on. This exists everywhere in the world, even in America, every country on the face of this planet. But the main problem is the failure in the economic management, resulted in miseries. And on top of that, we have despotism, supported by the West, and that aggravated the situation. And for them to topple a big band like Mubarak was unthinkable in December or November last year. I happened to attend a seminar in the Middle East Institute here where Ataur Rahman was lecturing, and I said, don't overrule the Arab streets. They have reached their tether and they will explode. He said, no, that's rhetoric. Don't listen to the internet. And don't listen. I said, these are catalysts for big explosion, and for it takes a crisis to change the whole scenario in any country. The point I want to make here, Professor, is that why you have this sinking feeling about? I have a very optimistic scenario. The Arabs, the Egyptians are thinking for the first time. You have not given us some information about the various NGOs who are presenting ideas and suggestions. And they have done research. Among them was Dr. I think his name is, I forgot to remember his name. Anyway, I'll come to his name. He was interviewed by the BBC, Habib, Dr. Tariq Habib. He's working for a European commercial company in Cairo, but his analysis was very rational. He said, they are looking into many aspects. They are scrutinizing every aspect. This is a real revolution. It's authentic. It's organic. It's the youth made this revolution, not the middle and the elderly. And he said they are looking at what is the best education system in the world. And you know what? They have mentioned that Finland has the best education system in the world, not America. For the first time, the Egyptians are really looking internationally, and they're thinking. And they're scrutinizing the legal system. They're scrutinizing the healthcare. They're looking into the food production. You know, you have the Nile, along the Nile. They will exploit the power of the Nile for electricity and all so on. So I think I've been following the internet all the time in Arabic. I found so close to my girls in Singapore. They said, my God, they're thinking. And they're listening also. They welcome critics. Egypt is a perfect example of the big picture of the revolution in the East. You should not have a sleeping spirit. You should be optimistic. Please. Okay,
Hi again. I completely agree with your assessment, and I think that like the Middle East is never going to be the same again because of this new citizen empowerment and awareness.
Even the events in Libya, which is trying to deflect their attention, has not affected them.
Absolutely. But then my second point is that why this sinking feeling, my own opinion is that there's some strong powers of counter-revolutionary powers that come into play. And so that's what I want to ask you about. Because do you see the role of certain conservative forces primarily emanating from the Gulf? What is their sort of role in the counter-revolution? Thank you.
In any revolution, there's a vacuum.
But the Gulf is filling it.
The outsiders cannot interfere anymore. Whatever America says, Europe says, is irrelevant to them.
I must give the chair floor to this.
Hi, my name is Dylan Vaughn. I'm a short-term researcher here. My question was just your opinion on these recent acquittals that you mentioned towards the end. One issue that I was wondering about is one of the last vestiges of the NDP supposedly is in municipal and criminal courts, that a lot of his sort of regime cronies or et cetera are still filling in these positions. So, the government has said, or the armed forces have said that these acquittals are fine, they're under law, et cetera, but people are upset about it. People are, outside, the courts, talking, yelling, demonstrating, if you will. So I just wanted to see your opinion on these acquittals.
So three very good questions. The first, I'm to friend. I've never been in a position where I've left Egypt and people say, "Oh, where did you come from?" And I say Cairo, and they say, "Wow." It's a really great sort of feeling for anybody who's spent any time there to have, it's a very complicated one for me because, as I said, I'm part Egyptian and part English. At the same time, we do have serious problems ahead of us, and I don't think that the region will ever be the same again. And I think that. For all of the problems that we have, the culture of fear has been broken, and the culture of hope has been restored. But at the same time, we do have some issues. You talked about these NGOs. Most of these NGOs are extremely new. They weren't allowed to operate. I mean, I remember the day after Mubarak fell, I met a young man in Tahrir Square, and he said, I tried to organize recycling in my neighborhood, and I wasn't allowed to do recycling. And the security services told him, in sort of a roundabout kind of way, well, if you organize for recycling, then what else are you going to organize about? It got to that level that the organizing these types of activities were really put down. Also, many of these NGOs that you speak of, they're unfortunately focusing on Cairo and Alexandria. Which is not where the majority of Egyptians live. Egypt is a country of more than 83 million people. About 20 million of them exist in Cairo, less in Alexandria. So, the overwhelming majority of Egyptians have no impact from these sorts of institutions. And they're very elite, sort of run and driven. So I do think that they will do good things in the future, but there are challenges before them. And I'm also concerned that the unity of the revolutionary forces is not as it should be. And you do have, there's a difference between having differences of opinion, okay? Because I think that exists in any system, whether it's a democratic one or not. But we do see the potential here where there is actually no need for a counter-revolution at all, because the revolutions will do it on their own. They'll do a counter-revolution against themselves. You mentioned that this was led by the youth. Sorry, that this is a youth revolution.
Yes.
It was begun by the youth, but this is also what made Tahrir and the revolution so special, that it ceased to be by the youth and became something for all of Egypt. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious. So I hope that came through, and I wouldn't have wanted any of you to think that we're pessimistic about the future, but we're also very we are very careful though, because a friend of mine put it to me yesterday that the revolution that we had over the past 6 months was actually a warning about what kind of revolution could happen. Okay, because this was actually, I mean, people don't realize this because they can't see the big picture of it, but this uprising in the past, what happened in January and February, and then what's continued after that, this is actually releasing some of the pressure on the system. It's not an explosion. This is not an explosion. This is not an explosion. This is really, venting a bit of gas. And if it does not succeed, then it's very likely that there will be a much more dramatic sort of upsurge, because now the Egyptian people have made it very clear. We're not satisfied anymore.
As Clinton says, the problem is not foreign policy; it's economically stupid in the magazine issue. He said, "It's economics, and he told his audience, "You stupid, you learn very fast." And our problem is the same. It must be proper economic evaluation. What I'm trying to point out here is that in any vacuum, in East Germany, when the communists were defeated, it was a big vacuum. Even up to now, there is a teething problem existing. So this cannot be eradicated overnight. Yeah, corruption, I agree with you, is very well known in the Middle East. But I believe that the new government in Egypt will be able to stifle it. Nobody can eradicate it.
Well, see, that's part of the issue, because the economic situation is bad, and it will take time. I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that patience for that time to actually allow for the economic situation to improve may actually not be there. I mean, we have a population of more than 40% that is around the poverty line who have lost out as a result of the revolution. And economic management will take time. It's time that they may not be willing to give.
Professor Haria, Saudi Arabia invested multi-million projects outside Alexandria for agriculture. But it was stifled by the Mubarak regime.
Yes.
Because you know that.
Yes.
And the Gulf have a lot of money to invest in Egypt.
You're assuming that they will do that now?
Yes, they will.
I would not be sure about that.
Mohammed, let our friend finish, I'll come back to you.
No, I mean, this is very good because it links us to this sort of counter-revolutionary issue as well.
I'm very optimistic about it.
We would all love to be. And I think that, again, the culture of hope has been restored. So I put that video on purpose to let you know that this is where we're coming from.
I almost cried.
And you were in Cairo, so I expect so. Because nobody, I mean, it was quite something quite incredible to live through. But the counter-revolution is quite real. And it's something that I'm not sure that the revolutionary forces in Egypt are prepared to deal with. And that counter-revolution, I mean, I'm not so big on this whole thing about the Gulf. We do know that Saudi Arabia in particular has been identified as extremely unhappy with all of these uprisings around the region.
But they'll cash in on it.
Yes.
Since it's already happened.
They
may try, but they may also try to roll it back somewhat.
Because of the Egyptian revolution, there is a law of succession in Saudi Arabia. They changed. Now the king cannot have his son as the next king. There are 40 people in the council. There'll be election. You know about that?
Yes.
And you know, before you came to Singapore, or maybe when you were on the air, the two chairs at Ahmad Musa. Ahmad Musa, the NGOs, there's a meeting, and this was not reported. And they have rejected Baradai or Baradai as the West call it. They don't like any foreign intervention. There will be leaders coming out from the roots, the grassroots level. I am sure about that. And it's a genuine revolution, organic, authentic, and don't feel stressed. It's not a so-called revolution, it's a real
No,
I have two questions really when you finish up. Pass it to them.
Okay, because I do need to finish the other two. The counter-revolution that is taking place, I think is very real. I think that it happens mostly from within the country. I'm sure that there are actors outside of the country that would like very much to get involved. And the suspicion has been for some time that Saudi Arabia has been supporting certain groups within Egypt, particularly these Salafi movements as well as the Muslim Brotherhood. This, I think, will actually come to a swift end over the coming year or so, because of the fact that now people know about that. People are very open about it, and as our friend told us, that Egyptians are not interested in getting foreign help anymore. In fact, they turned down the IMF last week. So the Saudi Arabian and other Gulf sort of influence, I don't think it'll be quite leading that charge, although they may have wanted to. Having said that, the acquittals that you spoke of the different ministers, these were acquittals of certain charges. They weren't all the charges that were brought against them. So I think that's important. I mean, Habib Adli, the interior minister, he was convicted of some very minute charges for about 15 years. And at first people were very annoyed and angry. It was like, how could he be convicted for only 15 years? And I said, yeah, but that's just one charge. And have many others that are leading them. So we wait to see what will happen in that regard. And I don't think that the military ruling council, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, SCAF, are quite unrealistic as to suppose that the Egyptian street will tolerate having all of these guys simply, let loose. But again, I mean, we're operating in a system where, for example, people want to imagine that, and this is true, I think, of most Egyptians, they want to imagine that the court system is pure in a system that is corrupt, which is silly.
Absolutely.
And also that the military has, the most heartfelt aspirations of the Egyptian people at heart, which it doesn't. It seeks to protect the country from external invasion and to maintain stability. Okay, it's not a democratic force. It's not a human rights force. It's not anything like that. It's also not against those things either. But that's not what its aim and purpose is. And it intervened in February because it saw, and this is what I really think is the case, that Mubarak simply could not control the country any longer, and they didn't want to see the country fall into complete and utter chaos. And they should be applauded for that, if nothing else. But the counter-revolutionary struggle is definitely real. And it is very unfortunate, and this is where I think some of my pessimism comes in, it's very unfortunate that we see different revolutionary forces accusing each other of being counter-revolutionary. This is the Muslim Brotherhood did it to some of the liberals and the secularists. Okay, they said, if you move for this, then it means that you are a Zionist and counter-revolutionary and I don't know what. And also on the flip side.
But the Islamists never solve any problem. Never, ever.
I don't think I said that they did.
Can I ask for that?
Of course, yes.
Please.
My name is Ahmed. I'm Egyptian. I'm an engineer working here in Singapore. Do you still believe that the military is sincere about bringing the old regime to justice? Especially that definitely they are engaged in all this corruption. If they bring the old regime, definitely they will be somehow charged as well.
So the military?
Yes. So especially there's some rumors now, some news that the sons of the Ministry of Defense having some business with the sons of the presidents. So mean that at the end he will be touched. So do you think they will be able to bring this to justice or not?
Okay,
Second-
one or two more. Oh, sorry, you have another question?
Okay. Also from outside, do you believe that US will allow the Egyptians to bring democracy to their country?
You don't know what the US is.
Sorry? Yeah.
Yeah. So just now you mentioned that the economic situation in Egypt is so bad.
Oh, you didn't identify it.
Oh, sorry. I'm an intern here at the MI. I'm an undergraduate and in US. Okay. Just now you mentioned that the economic situation was bad and there doesn't seem to be patience amongst the Egyptians for that time. And I just remember we had a professor from the Philippines who attended one of our talks here at the MI, and she mentioned the Filipino case of Aquino. When she came to power, she had such a popular mandate that it gave her legitimacy, which earned her patience from the Filipinos, and who also stood by her even they knew she was going to make mistakes, so they had that patience for her to learn her political lessons. So do you see anybody currently in the Egyptian political arena who might have that strong enough personality to weather out? Thank you, sir.
Was there one more? Yes, please.
Good to see you again. I'm half Egyptian myself. I really feel myself as I feel myself very Egyptian actually, and so it's true that it really strikes the heart. It's about what's happening in Tahrir and the hope about what's going to follow up. I'm wondering about the role of the ulama. You mentioned about the Salafis and Wahhabis moving around, and there was this recent report about demolishing of makams in Egypt, and then there was a reaction. So I was wondering. It seems that the ulama have been very quiet, and this is also in Yemen and also in other parts. We don't hear their voice. Is there a voice? What are they doing? Are they influencing things? That's one. The other thing is Israel. If you look at it in terms of geopolitics and region, Israel seems to be very, very worried about this Arab Spring, and in particular what's happening in Egypt, plus the opening of the borders in Gaza. And then there was a report that it was closed and it was open and it was just some confusion. Maybe you can shed light on that. What is the dynamics going on? Because Egypt is, after all, in transition, and people are still saying that things are very fragile. And there was this, of course, the worry about the whole revolution being hijacked. So who's in the position to hijack this revolution? Also, something to know for you. If we can shed light on that. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I didn't catch your name. Ahmed? Ahmed, how long have you been in Singapore?
6 years.
Like, take it to Salam, inshallah.
I went twice after the revolution.
Alhamdulillah. Is the military sincere? I think I've been very clear that the military has one aim in mind: to restore a sense of stability in the country. And if they think that stability means bringing people to justice, then that's what they'll do. Not because it's right or wrong, but because including the top-ranking generals. Okay, if they really think that, look, Hosni Mubarak was their own, okay, and they pulled him down. They pulled him down because they thought he cannot coexist in Egypt and have order and stability at the same time. So everybody is dispensable. I firmly believe that. It's not about whether they're good or bad. This is not their criterion for deciding actions. Of course they will resist. They resisted pulling down Mubarak for 18 days. Okay? They did not change their opinion about Hosni Mubarak as a person from the 24th of January to February 11th. Okay? No opinion was changed. What changed is they thought he could not fulfill the role that he was supposed to fulfill and maintain stability in the country. Okay? So you ask even themselves, even Mubarak left. Okay? And all of them will have that same sort of approach. This is my reading of the situation. How much will they resist that? Yes, I'm sure they'll resist it quite a lot. And I think that this is another reason why they're being very slow about doing these sorts of things. Firstly, because they're not competent to move in these sorts of arenas anyway, but also because they want to have a minimum of change, because change always brings instability, and they want stability back. They want to be able to go back to the role that they had before. They don't want to be in this position. They want to go back to the barracks. They want to go back to their usual way of running things. They don't want to be like Pakistan. Okay, they don't want to be in a situation where the military is directly involved in running the country. So they will do, I think, anything that it takes, but over a long period of time. Okay, so I really don't think that anybody in the Egyptian military should assume that they are above what the military as a whole will tolerate. But it will take a great deal of time. And toleration is not, again, it's not about that if you're a corrupt army general, then we're going to put you in charge. No. It will be about, if we keep you in your position, is this going to cause us more problems for stability or not? And if they decide it will cause us more, such that we simply cannot allow it to continue, then yeah, they'll get rid of them. Just as they got rid of Hosni Mubarak. Okay? That is the calculation that I think that they make. Is the U.S. going to allow democracy? Well, let me put it this way. On February 11th, I was in the square, and they had screens in the square. They had these huge screens in the square. And at one point, Obama congratulated the Egyptian people on their revolution. Most people didn't care. Frankly, there were some people who said, "Oh wow, Obama congratulated the Egyptians on the revolution." And one person said, "If he supports the revolution, then it's in his benefit, and if he doesn't, we couldn't care less." Because it's really not, we didn't ask for it. And actually it was very interesting. Hillary Clinton visited Egypt a little while after the uprising took place and Mubarak fell. She expected, I think fully, that she would be welcomed to Egypt and that the Egyptian people would be very pleased to have the leader of America come and congratulate them on. Actually, Egyptians were looking for an apology. It's like, where were you for 30 years and why were you supporting Hosni Mubarak? That's what they wanted. It wasn't that they wanted to give him a thank you for like 7 days of kind of wish-washy, going back and forth, shall we support, shall we not support? They wanted an apology for the last 30 years. That was the feeling that I got from pretty much everybody that I spoke to in Egypt. Whether that's right or not is irrelevant. It's the sentiment that's on the street. I don't think any country wants to allow or disallow democracy or dictatorship or anything. They want their own national interests. So if the United States believes that it's in their national interest to have a democracy in Egypt, one that they will be friendly with, then I think that they will support that. And I think that that's the calculation they'll make. They'll make it on the basis of their national interest. And very few countries, unfortunately, in the world judge their national interests on the basis of morality. They base it on the basis of what can I get out of it. So we wait and see. Are they going to make that calculation that they think that actually it's unsustainable for us to have relationships with states that put down their own people and maintain such close relations with them, such that anti-American feeling just goes up and up and up and up and up? Or is it more in our benefit to try to build things on the ground and therefore support grassroots and by extension democratic movements? We'll wait and see. And I think you probably have your own thoughts about that. The economic situation in Egypt, who can be charismatic? So this is a pessimistic part. Okay, the most popular presidential candidate in Egypt at the moment is Amr Moussa. He is the most popular presidential candidate in Egypt. There's no question about this. He is the most popular presidential candidate. It's very unfortunate, in my opinion, but because we didn't see him do very much with the Arab League, so I don't know what he's going to do with Egypt. There you go. So I don't really know what he's going to do with Egypt, but he is the most popular one because he's the most well known, not because of any other reason. Baradei is extremely unpopular, actually, which is a pity, but it has to do with several things. He was out of Egypt for a while, so people think that he's not really up to date, which is a bit unfair. But what can you do? Also, there was a big smear campaign about Baradei. Before Mubarak fell, things in the newspapers, they were attacking him on a regular basis, saying, he's a foreign agent and all this sort of stuff. So people actually don't have the highest regard for him at all. And he hasn't been a very good politician, I'll be honest. He doesn't do politics very well. I think he's got some great ideas, but I think that he's not playing the political game very well. As a result of that, I don't see him, being able to command the imagination of the Egyptian people. When you ask about other figures that presently exist, and this is where I think our friend Ustaz Talib is very correct, there are many people in Egypt that could become very well known and very charismatic and so on, and I think we have to wait and see how quickly they will sort of be pushed to the front. Because the ones that exist at the moment, none of them really, get the imagination of the Egyptian people. We have a judge who's running as a presidential candidate, Bastwisi. Nobody's particularly impressed with him. Amr Musa, as I said, who's just very well known. His name is well known. Baradei. Aysam Sharaf, who I would have thought would be able to command more of a popular kind of sentiment, but unfortunately he's also not particularly well known. And people have been doing polls over the last few months saying, do you know the name of the Prime Minister? And they'll say no. I mean, you have to keep in mind, 40% of Egypt is around the poverty line. You can go to the most developed societies in the world and ask them the most basic questions about their own country, and they won't be able to answer the questions. I say that about the UK, where I'm from. It can be very embarrassing when you have a guy who doesn't actually know that our Prime Minister is called David Cameron, but it happens, and I think in the United States it happens on a regular basis. So imagine what it's like in Egypt. Tantawi, who is the head of the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, is probably fairly popular, I'll be honest, among quite a wide swathe of the population, because they view him to be the head of the military, and the military as an institution is quite popular in Egypt. Okay, so they're willing to tolerate things that I would hope that they would not tolerate, but they're willing to tolerate a fair bit of the different sort of human rights abuses that have happened at the hands of the military. But again, the military is identified as that force that brought down Hosni Mubarak. Okay, and the military, we don't know who did it for sure, but we do know that somebody in the Egyptian government during the time of Hosni Mubarak ordered the military to open fire on Tahrir. And we know the military said no. People won't forget that. They won't forget that. This is very different in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. Okay? The Egyptian military would not fire on Egyptian civilians. So people won't forget that. So I think for those types of reasons, Tantawi has a certain amount of popular support, but he won't run for president. They've made it very clear they will not put a presidential candidate. So, if the most popular one is Amr Musa, who is also ridiculed and so on, and who gets like 30% of the rating, and really it's only because he is known, because his name is known, because he's been in Egyptian politics at a very high level for decades, so people know who he is. Then it begs the question, who will be that person in October, if we have presidential elections, who will be able to capture enough of the imagination of the Egyptian people? And we may not find that out until like a month before. A friend of mine put it to me like this, that the average lifestyle of an Egyptian politician nowadays is 2 weeks. So we may, because somebody will say something and they'll uncover something and then that's it. I mean, things are moving very, very quickly. So everything that I tell you today may be out of date in a week from now. And I hope that at least the pessimistic parts of it are. Role of the ulama and Israel and who's in a position to hijack. You always ask the easiest questions. Let me take them back by back. Who's in a position to hijack? I said it before and I'll say it again. I think the Egyptian people are in a position to hijack their own revolution away from themselves. And it worries me, again, how easy it's been in particularly the last 2 to 3 months for disputes to take place where there really shouldn't have been too much of a dispute. And where there's been a lot of fear-mongering in certain parts of the Egyptian elite about the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is not my favorite political group. It's also not Al-Qaeda. And it's a fairly pragmatic one. And I think that there are reasons to be concerned about it in the future. But I also think that it's inconceivable to think that the 18 days could have happened without the involvement of the government. Okay, and for that alone, people need to, they need to cut it out a little bit. And on the flip side as well. Okay, so the Brotherhood haven't been beneath saying and doing some pretty, despicable kind of things in order to get themselves ahead and characterize their opponents in, pretty appalling ways as well. So in that regard, everybody is as much a partisan as anybody else. But there are also elements within Egyptian society that are linked to the previous regime that I think, and I think this is a legitimate thing to say. I don't think it's a conspiracy. If Egypt were to bring to trial everybody who deserves to be brought to trial, there's a lot of people that would be brought to trial. And I think a lot of them are not willing to have that happen and know that they have 2 choices in that regard. They either leave the country or they make sure that they're not brought to trial. And if they're not brought to trial, it will be because the situation in the country remains unstable. Okay, so I think that there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in making sure that Egypt remains unstable in order to avoid having a stable system actually put them in front of the court. So that's one aspect of it. Vis-a-vis Israel. So you're right, actually. I think it was you or somebody else who said that Israel was very much in support of the regime right up until the end. It was only the last couple of days where, I think it was stated that, they weren't 100% behind Hosni Mubarak. Litany went to Washington a few weeks ago and said very clearly at the Aspen Institute that the reason for that was very clear, that Hosni Mubarak understood the importance of the peace treaty and was willing to stand up to his people. That was the basis of support. So that makes all that very clear. The reality now, of course, is that Egyptian public opinion is actually, playing a role in how Egyptian foreign and domestic policy operates. How strong that role will be depends on, the final political arrangement, and it's all in flux. So the peace treaty, I think, will definitely stay in place. I don't think it's going anywhere. I don't think that any political force in Egypt actually wants it to go anywhere. I think the Ikhwan have been very clear that they don't want to cancel the peace treaty. This is what I say when I say that they're pragmatic. If you'd asked them a year ago, what would you do? First thing we'll do is we'll cancel the peace treaty. Now that they actually are likely to get into parliament, it's like, well, actually, maybe the peace treaty is not such a bad idea. I think, pragmatism definitely wins out in a lot of this. But even highly liberal forces and secular forces in Egypt want to renegotiate the treaty. So that's interesting. Ayman Noor, who's one of the most liberal sort of candidates for the presidency, and who actually got thrown in jail for running against Mubarak on trumped-up charges a few years ago. He said very early on, if I were to be elected, and I don't think there's a chance of that at all, but if I were to be elected, then I would want to renegotiate some of the terms of the treaty. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Egypt about some of the terms of that treaty. You know, the prices of, you know, gas that is sold, etc. But, you know, I mean, I think what will happen is that Israel will say no, and Egypt will kick up a fuss, and Israel will say no again, and then, you know, we'll move on to other things. I mean, it's just the nature of international treaties and international politics. And I'm not sure if there's a time limit on the treaty. I don't think that there is. So I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. But what I do think is quite likely is that there will be a much colder peace. I don't think that the Egyptian regime, in any shape or form, no matter what happens over the coming months, is going to be as close to Israel as it was during the time of Hosni Mubarak. I doubt that very much. But I don't know where that will lead either. I mean, you saw that the two Palestinian factions, Hamas and Fatah, they came to Cairo, and everybody thought that Egypt had brought them together. A few weeks later, they split up again. So we don't know what will happen in that regard. But I do think that this is a very key time for Israel, actually. I'm not Israeli, but I do think that it's very clear that this is a very precarious time for Israel, because for a long time, Israel's foreign policy has been based on the idea that these individuals, such as Mubarak, would remain in power. So they constructed their strategies accordingly. Okay, as I said, you know, national interest will always, you know, win out in that regard. I don't think they've actually considered the alternative scenario, that there would actually be democracies in this region. As most people, by the way, I mean, they're not the only ones in that regard, including the Egyptians and everybody else. I'll be interested to see what happens in that regard. God knows. The role of the ulama. Ulama, for your other guests, are Islamic scholars. Some people call them clerics. They're more like academics of religious teachings. And the ulama in Egypt were divided on the revolution. There's a long-standing tradition within Sunni Islam to tolerate oppression in order to safeguard society from civil strife. Okay? This is a long-standing kind of default position, that even if the ruler is a tyrant, then as long as the tyranny that exists is not greater than the possible upheaval that would take place in trying to overthrow that tyrant, then it is tolerated. Not to give it a moral kind of virtue in any regard, but to simply safeguard society from upheaval and, I mean, they call it fitna, you know, anarchy and so on. A great number of people felt like that, and there were definitely some very high-profile figures within Egyptian religious society in that regard. There were some who didn't view the situation like that at all, where they viewed that the anarchy or the civil strife or the fitna that was Hosni Mubarak had to be removed instead. You had some ulama who, from the Azhar, who came out very, very strongly and said that participation in the protests was a communal obligation, fard al-kifaya, which meant that, you know, if the community at large participated with at least some people, then the responsibility was relieved of society at large. But if nobody participated, then the whole of society is sinning. Okay, you know, it's quite a strong sort of thing to say. Even those that were very uncomfortable with the revolution or the uprising, they came out afterwards and explained why, which I think is legitimate. one of the most significant figures in Egyptian religious in the Egyptian religious community had a sort of 2 or 3 hour interview on live television where he said, I and others in the Egyptian religious administration, we were afraid that what happened in Libya would happen to Egypt. So obviously we didn't want that to happen. We never dreamt that God would spare us this, or that the military would actually come on the side of the people. And nobody really did. I mean, if you were there on, he came down on a Friday, okay? On Thursday night, I was in Zamalek, near Kulsum Hotel. I was there because I was with some friends and we were waiting for this speech that was supposed to come from Hosni Mubarak. And we really thought that he was going to say, I'm leaving for the sake of the country or whatever, but that I'm leaving. And we were all going to leave the cafe, because Egyptians always just sit in cafes. We were going to leave the cafe and descend upon Tahrir. He was supposed to give a speech at, I think, 9 o'clock. Oh my God. He ended up giving it about 45 minutes later. The level of tension in the room was excruciating. I mean, I kept seeing people running off to the bathroom. They were physically under pressure. It's like, no, the president will give his speech momentarily. I mean, it just went on like that for about 45 minutes. Jeez, please come out and say whatever you have to say. And there was this big sort of high that was building up. And then finally he gave the speech, and
Recorded.
it was recorded. You could see that it was recorded. It was supposed to be live, but it was definitely recorded. You could see that it was recorded. But the speech was awful. I mean, it was absolutely terrible. If he had given that speech 10 days before, he probably would have sold everything. Okay? But at that point, it was absolutely terrible. I mean, far too little and very, very late. But it was really quite terrible. So the level of kind of crash was incredible. There's like highs, and then there was a crash, and there was a crash. There was a real crash. Everybody was just sort of like, what the heck just happened? How on earth could this guy actually say this? And then that crash turned into confusion, and then that confusion turned to anger. And then that anger turned into this resolute determination that tomorrow we are ready to die. And literally like that. It's like, but tomorrow is our day. Not our day that we will go and kill, but our day that we will go and die. That we will not permit ourselves any longer to live in a country where this is the state of affairs. That if they want to kill us, then that's fine. Because one way or another, he's coming down. One way or another, down, leave, one way or another. It was that sort of feeling that I saw from people. That was the incredible sort of thing. And then another thing came on TV, where the national television service said momentarily the army will actually say something. And that was really quite fascinating, because we were waiting, and we thought, okay, fine, this is going to be the point where everything changes or it doesn't, where the army is going to say, we've taken office, or we've taken control, or that they're going to throw themselves behind Hosni Mubarak. And we're like, that's it, that's when we're going to see everything very, very clear. And then they gave no statement. There was no statement at all. By that point, most of us were just sort of like, I'm not waiting. We've already gone to the bathroom 50 times, and not doing that again. The shisha's over there, okay. It really got to that sort of point. And what happened in reality was that probably at that moment, the army went to the presidential palace and told Hosni Mubarak, shukran qawi, it's time for your vacation, and we're taking you to Sharm el-Sheikh under our special hospital or whatever, and that they just forced him out, because I think the military actually expected him to resign. I think they actually expected him to resign. And when he didn't, they were just sort of like, la, 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 la. بلاش كلام فارغ. يعني this is the end. We didn't hear about that until the next day in the afternoon, and you know when we knew when the tanks, there were tanks in front of the presidential palace with the turrets actually pointing out, and then they flipped. And then we knew that it had been done. And that, I was at home actually thinking, that's it, nothing's going to happen, the military has thrown their weight behind Mubarak and we can expect a lot of bloodshed. And then my wife called me and said, Hisham, Omar Suleiman is on TV. I was like, oh great, like, as if I didn't have to wait for some silly speech yesterday, I have to wait for another one today. No, forget it, I'm not interested, I'm not going to listen. And it was the shortest speech. It was like
30 seconds.
Yeah, 23. I could. It was really short, and you could see the look of torment on his face. And it was just simply that President Mubarak has turned over the mansab of the title or position of President of the Republic. Allahumma afu. I mean, that's the way that it always ends. But nobody expected that. I mean, I want you to understand this because I know that a lot of people were wondering why weren't more people in support of the Egyptian uprising during the uprising. And the reality is that we all expected, myself included, all Egyptians expected that what happened in Syria would have happened to Egypt. And nobody wants that to happen. Nobody wants that to happen. So we really did expect it. But then, Hosni Mubarak I think deserves a lot of praise and gratitude because without Hosni Mubarak, Tahrir Square could never have taken place. Honestly, it is inconceivable. I mean, it's just incredible to perceive how many times during those 18 days he made such lousy decisions that resulted in Tahrir Square actually taking place. At every single point. I mean, I was talking about this with one of my hosts earlier today. Egypt. Who's been to Egypt? I should have asked that before. Raise your hand if you've been to Egypt. So what's the national pastime of Egyptians? Be honest.
Shisha.
Okay. The second one then. Gossip. Okay.
Go together.
Yeah, actually they do, don't they? So going out and gossiping. This is the national pastime of Egyptians. In a country where the national pastime is gossip, you cut telephones and internet. Of course they left their homes to go and protest. They wanted to go talk to people. That's really, this was very, very clear. You couldn't have a society like Egyptian society just simply say, we're going to stay at home. We had curfew. There was curfew for, what was it, something like 17 or 18 hours of the day. Nobody paid attention to curfew at all. At all. The only thing that changed is that during curfew hours, we had the popular committees controlling traffic. Otherwise, people were just going around, just they normally go around. That's simply the way that it unfolded like that. And I do think that there's a lot of challenges for the future. I do think that there's a great deal of hope and optimism that people can have. And I hope that the next time I come to Singapore, I'll be able to tell you about the new Egyptian model that has been crafted for other Arab countries to emulate. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Before we came in, Dr. Halia told me that he would like to have an exchange with the people here. He saw there's a good crowd, so he'd like to have an exchange. Then I saw Muhammad, so I said, you are going to get the exchange. So, thank you very much. I joined you all to thank Dr. Halia. It was really a very nice exchange. We learned a lot, and people expressed themselves, and this is the kind of symposiums that we like, and we are glad we had it. Thank you very much. Please join me to thank again.